Welcome to Unit 2, the Constitutional Crises. In this unit, we're going to be looking at different constitutional crises that were throughout American history. And a constitutional crisis is a crisis that is centered around a certain ideology or right that people are fighting over. The reason it's called constitutional is generally those rights are disputed in the Constitution of the United States. Whether it be gun control or freedom of speech or abortion, these things are rooted into certain rights which are outlined in the Constitution of the United States, and people are arguing or fighting over how that is interpreted in the Constitution, which creates a crisis. Some crises are more severe than others. Some result in killings, war, bloodshed. Others result in just fierce battles, fighting language-wise and in news and in the media. Whatever it is, you will be trying to determine what the next constitutional crisis will be in the United States of America. In our first section, we're going to be learning about the American Revolution, which is the very first constitutional crisis. And so we'll be using these to kind of understand what a constitutional crisis is, how they form, how they start, and how they develop. And you'll be trying to take that and do a comparison with a modern day example of a constitutional crisis. Our American Revolution is going to be centered really on the years 1776 to 1783. This is how long the war itself lasts, and so we'll be talking about this time period for the majority of the time. In class, we'll be going into a little bit more in the post-American Revolution. We'll be looking at documents in the Constitution itself to try to better understand the crisis and how this occurred. Now, in our objectives, they are as follows. The focus question is, what is the next constitutional crisis? You will be trying to research and understand what you believe the next one could be, whether it be, again, gun control, abortion, or it be Trump and impeachment, or how countries relate to other countries in elections. Whatever it is, we're going to be looking at what the next constitutional crisis will be. Our first objective is to understand what events demonstrate that the colonists were displeased and not happy with the English. What really needs to start for a constitutional crisis to begin is you have to be able to find examples or events that really demonstrate displeasure or anger from a group of people to another group. So if you look around right now, are American people happy with the way things are going? Some of you might say yes, some of you might say no, but if you say no, you should be able to point to a couple events that demonstrate this anger and frustration. In Objective 2, what happened at the Continental Conventions? We're looking at the first and the second Continental Conventions to determine what the conventions did and what they were doing at the time of the Revolution. In Objective 3, we're going to look at some significant battles, both at the very beginning of the war. We're going to look at the turning points of the war, where the war turns for the betterment of the United States, and we'll be looking at the final battles of the United States versus the British. And then our last objective is going to be Objective 4. What were the many interests of the different groups involved? So we're going to be looking at the many different groups that were fighting at this time period and their viewpoints and what they're fighting over. So if we were to periodize this, now remember, periodization is like timelining a time period. So if we were to periodize this, we would break it up into the following periods. First time period we would call the no turning back period, which is about 2 years, 1774 to 1776. These are events that are leading up to the revolution, up to the fighting, and result in generally no turning back. There's no going back. There's no becoming friends with England again. There's no becoming the loyal subjects of England again. It's pretty much over in these 2 years, and we're sealing kind of our fate against it. The next period would be the Declaration of Independence. And this gets a whole period to itself, simply because of how important that declaration is. It's going to outline why we think we should be free, what we will do with our freedom, and how important it is for us. Then we'll look at the contenders, the people who have different stakes in the Revolutionary War, and what they were, kind of their different viewpoints. And we're also going to be looking at the early years of the war, the turning points of the war, and the war and the society it had, the impact it had on society. After we kind of wrap up this whole time period of the wars and understanding that, we're going to draw some general conclusions in 1783, just some general things that happened. Now, to set the stage with everything, we're going to first talk about the road to war. Before we get into all this stuff with the Sons of Liberty and the Boston Massacre, take a second and just summarize the kind of history I'm about to give you now. The reason it's important is because you can't really understand the events I'm about to talk about, the Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, without understanding first what's going on here. So earlier on, the United States is having some, or not the United States, I should say, colonial America, the 13 colonies, is having a really difficult time with Native Americans. Native Americans are angry. They feel like their land has been taken slowly, bit by bit and bit, by the colonists, and they're very frustrated and angry. Now, the Native Americans have a common friend, or not a common friend. They have an they the French and the Native Americans have a common enemy, and that is us, the English. The French and Native Americans decide to join together. They already, like we talked about, had a much better relationship with the Native Americans, and they decide that they're going to try to stop colonists, that they're going to, in fact, inflict harm. They will actually do some really terrible things, going into colonial areas and killing just people really quickly and then running off. It could be men, women, and children, but whatever it is, it's causing a lot of frustration and anger with the colonists. The colonists would like to go and fight the Native Americans themselves, but there is some reservations in that. Now, England has a choice. Do they allow this conflict to continue, or and just let the colonists try to fight it, or do they themselves try to step in and stop the fighting? Now, the fighting that we're talking about is going to be called the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. This conflict is centered on the Native Americans and the French versus the Americans and the English. What ends up happening is the British send soldiers over. They decide that it is their job to protect the citizens, the colonists. While they do this, it's incredibly expensive to do so. They send over soldiers, materials, clothing, weapons, food, everything that you can imagine. Think of how expensive that is. Now, in relation to this, think for a second of how expensive the Iraqi war was. The Iraq war lasted from about 2004 till about 2011. That war cost us anywhere between $3 to $4 trillion. So wars are expensive. And how do you pay for wars? Well, generally through taxes. So after the war's all finished and the British beat the Native Americans and the French, the question now is how do we pay for the war? Now, if you are an American, you believe that high taxes and the British abusing their power mean that you shouldn't have to pay for it. This was their job. You're a colonist. It's not like you need to pay for these things. It's just being part of the loyal subject of the crown. They also are going to accuse the British of what they call salutary neglect. Salutary neglect is when they believe the British have basically ditched their role as being the safe, the guidance and the safe, the overseers of the colonists. And so they're going to say that they are guilty of this and that they don't have really a leg to stand on. So in their perspective, British have broken rules. They're not taking care of the colonists. Therefore, they aren't supposed to have to pay for the war. On the other hand, the British say, hey, you know what? War is expensive. We came, we helped you, we stopped the British, and you guys aren't following the rules that we've outlined. Therefore, you should have to pay the cost. This is just the cost of government. It's the cost of living with a good government. What's going to end up happening is a lot of colonists are going to be angry. Now, you have lots of different groups. You have some that are very pro-English, who think everything's fine. You have others that are pro-English, but they think that the crown is doing some wrong things. You have people in between who just don't really know what they believe. And then you have people who are very against the crown. And one of the groups that's going to be really against the crown is going to fight it, and is going to be one of the early groups to really combat this, is going to be the Sons of Liberty. They are an incredibly organized chapter throughout the northern United States, and this group is going to really, their whole mission statement is to hurt and disrupt the British in whatever their achievements or goals are. And again, they're going to say, you know what, Brits, for years, for 70 years, 100 years, you guys have basically left us to our own will. You've just basically left us high and dry, done nothing for us, and we have done a good job taking care of ourselves, and we don't really want your help anymore. You didn't really help us a ton in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. We did that ourselves. Therefore, you don't have a right to ask us for taxes. They are going to try to undermine as much as they humanly possibly can. Now, the anger, frustration is going to culminate in the very ends of the 1760s and into the very beginning of the 1770s, where we can start to see real anger emerging from the colonists. In 1770, in Boston, Massachusetts, and Boston, out of any of the places in the 13 colonies, is by far the most contentious, angry area of colonists towards the crown. In Boston, these revolutionists, these sons of liberty, are not happy with the status quo, and so they're going to do some different things that is going to cause quite an event, and is going to cause a lot of anger between colonists and the Brits. Now, this is one example for our first objective, which is what events demonstrate that there was colonial frustration and anger towards the Brits. Boston Massacre is the first one. We'll go into more detail in the next slide here, but that's the first one. The second one is going to be the Committees of Correspondence. Now think about it. At this time period, if you're from Virginia, you don't think of yourself as an American first. You think of yourself as a Virginian. This is important to understand because today, if you were traveling in Europe or China and somebody said, "Hey, where are you from?" you would say, "I am, an American." And they might say, "Oh, where an American?" You might say, "Idaho." But at this time period, no one would have said that. They would have said, "I'm a Virginian. I'm a Georgian. I'm a New Yorker." People identified themselves with the colony in which they were born or which colony they were from. And they had a lot of pride from that too. Lots and lots of pride. And a lot of people don't understand that people had a lot of pride. Now, today we can kind of understand it, and think about Idaho today. How many Idahoans are frustrated and angry with all the people moving, from California or other places into Idaho? There's a lot of frustration, right? We like Idaho. We like the way things are. We like our culture. So, with that being said, Idahoans have their own culture. Now, with that being said, all these 13 colonies have their own culture as well. So they're not all this united, happy bunch. In fact, a lot of times they downright just don't like each other. But they understand that they've got to speak to one another, that they've got to be on the same page, because if they're not, they're never going to be able to defend themselves from the Brits. So there's going to be the Committee of Correspondence, which is a committee between the 13 colonies that makes sure that everybody understands what's going on, so that way everybody can kind of be on the same page. If Virginia is boycotting something, it doesn't help if Massachusetts is not boycotting it. Everyone needs to be doing the same thing. And the last event that we're going to be talking about for that first objective is going to be the Boston Tea Party. It happens 3 years after the Boston Massacre. It happens again in Boston, and it's going to be probably the most iconic protest, I'd probably say in American history, and probably one of the most iconic protests in world history. And you know a lot about that, but we'll go into some detail about that as well. So first off, here we have the Boston Massacre. Look at this newspaper. This comes from a newspaper at the time period. Look at the picture of the event here. Historians would ask themselves a series of questions like, and so if you look at this relief here and look at the perspective of whoever it is that actually designed this, one thing that you'll notice is that this is definitely from an American or a colonial perspective. There's a couple of reasons why we can tell this. Number one, if we look at the British, look at how the British are charged. They're in a line, they're in order, they're being ordered to shoot and fire. Here they are being assertive and aggressive, while here you have these poor colonists who are minding their own business. There's even a dog, for heaven's sakes, and everybody's just minding their own business, and they're all of a sudden being fired upon. There's people laying dead in the street, and people are trying to get these poor people off of the street, and the British are still firing on them. And what you have is what we ultimately call the Boston Massacre. Even the word massacre really doesn't describe this adequately. Massacre usually means just a ridiculous amount of people dying in a horrible, disgusting, brutal way. In this event, you had 7 people that died. Now, I'm not saying 7 people isn't a lot. I'm not saying it wasn't tragic. It is. But to call it a massacre might be a little bit overboard, and the Americans purposely picked that because they in the American perspective, these colonists were doing nothing wrong. They were minding their own business, doing their own thing, when all of a sudden the British, who were incredibly aggressive, they were taking their swords out and showing the colonists and telling them that they could cut them up into pieces. They're yelling explicitives at them. They're saying all sorts of horrible things about them, taking advantage of them. And the colonists are going to say they were minding their own business, and they were upset at the time period. But all of a sudden these British soldiers just fired upon them, and it killed 7 people. It actually is the first African American casualty of the Revolutionary War. A man will die that's an African American here in Boston. Now, if you ask the British perspective, the British newspapers, they'll tell you that the soldiers were minding their own business, just working, doing their own posts, not saying anything, just doing exactly what they should have been doing, when some colonists decided to start yelling at them, insulting them, and even were throwing bricks of snowball bricks at them. They were taking bricks and putting them in snowballs and chucking them at the British. And so, the truth is probably a little bit of both. It's usually how it seems to work in history. There probably was a little bit of back and forth between the colonists and the British. However, we do know this: the British fired upon them because it could be that they got hit in the face with a brick, or it could be just that they just got sick of it. Whatever it is, 7 people die from this. Now, the actual person who made this picture here is actually Paul Revere. He was a silversmith, and Paul Revere, is very famous for the Midnight Ride, but he actually made this before, and he engraves it into silver, and then they use that relief as a way to print pictures in newspapers at the time. And so this is his perspective, which makes sense. He's an American colonist, he's a revolutionary, so of course he would be giving this kind of a perspective. What ends up happening is there is a court, there's a law, an American court system that hears and puts on trial the British soldiers, and eventually the British soldiers will be acquitted. Or not acquitted, they'll be charged with like some punishment, but it'll be very minor punishments, and a lot of Americans feel like it wasn't justice. Needless to say, though, what ends up the image from the event is almost more important than actually the truth of what happened. And that might seem weird, but the reason I say that is what ends up happening from this is Americans look at this event as a massacre. Now it causes more people to be even angry at the British, and even angrier at the way that things were handled. And so they are much more or less sensitive to the British perspective. That's an important reason. Now, the Boston Tea Party happens 3 years later. It's not nearly as violent. The stories go that basically there was a large meeting of people in a church, and Samuel Adams was speaking. And Samuel Adams is known as the fire of the revolution. He's kind of a pot stirrer. He just likes to cause problems. Sometimes a lot of people even argue that without Samuel Adams, there may have never been a Revolutionary War. Now, I don't know if that's true, but definitely he contributes to it. Well, as he's speaking at this meeting, a bunch of men, and some people say it was coded word, that Sam Adams said a certain word, and they all rose up and they started walking out. Now, why are they walking out? Well, they're going to go get dressed as Native Americans, Iroquois actually, and they're going to go off into Boston Harbor, where there are 2 ships that are just absolutely full of tea. And this tea is in these big tea chests, and in the tea chest there's these dried tea leaves that you would have for your tea. And they're sitting in this harbor. The harbor master has not signed the manifest of the ships yet, so the tea has not been allowed to come into shore yet. And so these men dressed up like Native Americans go out, and they bust open these chests, and they throw the tea into the ocean, into the harbor. Some say that it was such a drastic amount of tea leaves that it actually turned the harbor brown, and that the water tasted like tea. That's probably an exaggeration, considering that the harbor is salt water, and so I doubt it tasted like tea, but whatever it was a considerable amount of tea. Now, there's going to be some major repercussions for this. The king especially is furious after hearing about this. And so there's some different reactions of what's going to happen. First and foremost, the British are going to instill what's called the Intolerable Acts. Now, they don't call them that. We call them that. The reason we call them Intolerable Acts is because they were intolerable. He does this in 1774, right after the Boston Tea Party. And what this means is threatens Massachusetts, to get rid of its charter. This is significant because if he gets rid of the charter, it means you're not allowed to travel to Massachusetts anymore. You're not allowed to live in Massachusetts, at least by the king's authority. So that's a big deal. The other thing is that he closed Boston Port. He closes the harbor down, and he says this harbor will not open back up until you've paid every cent of the tea that you destroyed in the harbor. This will eventually happen. John Hancock will actually pay the amount of money of tea that was lost so that the harbor can open back up. But people are still extremely proud and excited about them, kind of making fools of the British. So that's going to be one of the big things. Now, another thing the king's going to do is he's going to start to institute different people. And instead of normally the colonists were used to, because they had so much freedom because they were so far away from England, they're used to electing their own officials, having their own people that they pick to be in charge. But instead, the king, and rightfully, it is actually his authority to do so, he is allowed to name, um, at least in royal colonies, he is allowed to name different people to the officials, the government officials. And so he's going to do that. He's going to say, after this happens, he's going to put General Thomas Gage in charge of Massachusetts. And this is a big deal because this general is pro King George III, making it so that the colonists don't like him and they don't feel like that he's their choice. They didn't elect him. He's some outsider. This is going to cause a lot of frustration and anger with the colonists. Now, what's going to end up happening from this is going to be the First Continental Congress, the first time that people from every one of the 13 colonies comes together and meets to discuss what do we do about the problem that we're having with England. Well, there's a couple things that they came to a consensus on. Number one, they did not want a war. Nobody wanted a war at this time. Well, not nobody, but most of them did not want a war. Most of them are wanting to fix this problem with the British. People like Benjamin Franklin are actually in England trying to see if they can't make a deal and restore the fractured relationship. Another thing that they're going to do is they're going to say we are committed to the crown, definitely committed to the king and to the crown. So they want that to be known too. They like to be British. They like to be British subjects. However, they also are not happy at all with the way that things have happened and ran. So they're going to boycott across all 13 colonies certain things. They're going to boycott British goods. They're not going to buy British tea. They're not going to buy British sugar. They're not going to use stamps on their documents. These are things that if they're unified, they can really hurt the British as far as their ability to make money. So this happens in the First Continental Congress. Now, remember, I told you that each of these colonies is kind of its own separate place. It's really, honestly, not an exaggeration to kind of think of it as its own country. So, North, Carolina is like a country compared to New Jersey. They both have their own identities. However, there are some shared things that we have amongst ourselves. We have common experiences as Americans. No matter where we're from, we're American. We have the same kind of common experiences. We have the same military services. People are serving together in the military to fight for everybody, not just one state, but all the states. There is the British troops that have really burned bridges with not only Massachusetts, but several of the colonies. They can print media across any of them, and everybody can read the same thing at one time. So we have a common press. There's also the sociocultural aspect of it as well. We have a same kind of a cultural identity no matter what. You go to different places in the United States, definitely people have different cultures, but there's also a common culture within that as well. At this time period, there's going to be a lot of anti-Indian and a lot of people angry at Native Americans, so there's going to be a common identity there as well. This is going to create what we call Americanisms. This is American culture and American ideology. There's also some differences, though. First and foremost, between us and the British is we have a weak aristocracy. Think about how organized British society is, especially at this time. You have your king who has lords, barons, baronesses, dukes, and duchesses. Everything and everybody knows exactly who they are and where they are in relation to somebody else. Now, in the United States, we have a much weaker aristocracy. There are wealthy people who are in charge and who have money and are intelligent and educated, and there's the very poor who aren't. But generally, it's nothing like England's aristocracy. It's very weak compared to that, which is, in today's viewpoints, at least in an American viewpoint, is a somewhat good thing. You don't want to have a lot of rich snobs walking around. Definitely, the United States has a much more open land policy. Geographically, there's tons more mobility in America than there is in England. You think about it, England is a fairly small country. I've literally traveled from Ireland all the way up to Wales, Scotland, and then back down to England in one day. So it was a big day, but still, that's a much smaller area than even what the 13 colonies, let alone the West today, is in comparison. In the United States, everyone is an immigrant here. In England, everyone's pretty much English, and they've been that way for a very long time. Or at least if they're not English, they definitely have been, under England's rule for hundreds of years. So there is this kind of in America, everyone is an immigrant. Nobody is native here except the Native Americans, but they're not part of this group that we're talking about yet. There's a lot of Indian fighting. Okay, something that the British back in the island can't even understand, and now we're finally starting to get a generation of Americans. So you think about take Thomas Jefferson for instance. His father and mother are from Snowdonia in Wales. They had moved over here and bought land and were living in Virginia. Thomas Jefferson is the first generation of an American. And that's typically what we have now going on. We have first and second generation Americans growing up and calling really America their home completely. With all this happening, we're going to go into our first period called the No Turning Back period between 1774 and 1776. At this time period, they're going to train and have several different people called Minutemen ready to fight at any minute. These men must have their guns, they must have their ammo, and they must be ready to fight in a moment's notice. So there's these Minutemen, and today we would really call these militia, state militias, in fact. And this is where a lot of the confusion comes into the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution. Many argue that the right to bear arms, the right to have guns, is actually not an individual American right, but instead is a state militia right. Because that's what really these were they were state militias. However, some people argue and say, yes, but what made up state militias? Colonists do. Everyday individuals. It wasn't professional army. It was just everyday people who made up these militia groups. Well, whatever it is, these militia groups, they were ready in a moment's notice to go and fight Brits. They were stockpiling weapons and gunpowder and all sorts of things in order to make sure that they were ready in case there was a fight. Now, two groups really emerge from this. You have the loyalists who believe that the British are fine and are good and they've done nothing wrong. And then you have what's called the Whigs. The Whigs are people that range from being very upset with the British to thinking that we should have a complete war and separate ourselves from England. And that's the two different groups we have at the time. All this anger and fighting is going to culminate in an area in Lexington and Concord. Now, Boston is the big major city there, and there are several smaller cities by Boston. And a couple of smaller cities are Lexington and Concord. These cities are incredibly important for a couple of reasons. Number one, colonists have been stockpiling weapons up to this point all throughout this area. A lot of these farmers wanted to be able to have weapons at a moment's notice, so they've been making these small little armories, small little depots full of weapons. The British know this. They're not stupid. That's one of the reasons that they come to Boston, is they're not only trying to control the anger, the frustration in the crowds, the revolts, the protests. They're actually trying to go out and they're trying to destroy these depots, get rid of these weapons, so that way the colonists don't have something to fight back with. In their pursuit of that, they're also hoping that they can catch two men, Sam Adams and John Hancock. Both of them are in hiding because if they're caught, they could be tried for treason and hung. So in Lexington and Concord, you'll remember the story that Paul Revere says to one of the people helping him, if you show me one lantern, I'll know it's one if by land, two if by sea. So two lanterns there. The Brits are coming to the surrounding areas through sea, and one, if they do that, it's going to be by land. Obviously, we know that Paul Revere sees one lamp. He goes to warn his friends and to tell the Minutemen to hide their weapons. And it wasn't just him. That's one thing that people don't realize, is that it wasn't just Paul Revere. There was 4 or 5 other men out on horseback trying to warn people. He was just one. In fact, he actually got caught during it. He reaches Lexington. He goes to a bar where Sam Adams and John Hancock are hanging out. He tells them that the British are coming, and he tells them they need to leave. Promptly, Hancock and Adams decide that they are going to leave, and then he starts to warn the countryside. Now, he gets caught and gets kind of taken away and held by some British soldiers. They don't really know what he's up to, but they probably know it's not up to good, but they don't really know what to do to him. So they will hold him for a while. Now, the Brits are going to get past. They're going to get into Lexington. They're going to find that John Hancock and Sam Adams are gone, that they're no longer there. And they're going to be marching on their way to Concord, where they're going to be trying to burn these weapon depots up. As they get there, they are met, the British are, with a group of militia, state militiamen, who are ready to fight. These are Minutemen. They are ready. And these men are not highly trained, but they are trained more than your average day citizen to fight. And they are ready to have this full-out brawl. The famous words of General Prescott, who is over the colonists, says, "Do not fire until fired upon, but if they fire, then by gosh, fire, fire, fire." So basically, nobody wants to start this war. Everybody understands that if we shoot, this literally starts the entire war, basically. And so nobody really wants to shoot to make the first shot. Whatever happens is a shot does go off, though, and it does start a small battle between these two groups. Nobody knows how that shot was fired, who fired it, if it was British or if it was American. Some speculate that Sam Adams was nearby as he was leaving and that he saw them about to just standing there looking at each other, so he shot in order to jump things, get them going. That is highly unlikely to be true, since Sam Adams had been warned way earlier and was probably miles away by this point. But that is a fun story that people like to pass down. Whatever happens on April 1775, a shot is heard. The colonists and the British, they have a major fight, and the colonists are going to withdraw eventually, but only after they have proven their ability to fight against the British. And this shot is called the shot heard around the world, not because it was really loud, but because simply it was such an important shot that it had a rippling effect to the rest of the world. So let's talk about this no turning back period from 1774 to 1776. So we talked about the First Continental Congress, and now we're going to talk about the Second Continental Congress. Compare the first one with the second one. What are some differences that you see between these two Continental Congresses? Well, number one, we can see that first and foremost, this is a much more aggressive Continental Congress. Again, people from every state are there or colony are there. The first thing that they decide is that they've got to make a national government. They are going to take up arms against the British. This is where they decide that we can't keep going this way anymore. We're going to declare war. So they decide that they're going to first, if you're going to declare war on another country, you better establish a government of your own. So they do. They make the Articles of Confederation. This government is a very loose government. The president of the country at the time is going to be John Hancock, who is going to act as the acting president. They're also going to create the Olive Branch Petition, which is basically a last-ditch effort to not go to war. They tell England that basically they've decided that they're going to separate from them, and that England, if they want to avoid war, better sign a treaty saying that we're our own country now. The Brits obviously weren't going to do that, and the colonists knew that. But it looks good to say that they tried. And then one of the most important documents in American history is going to be created, called the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. This is going to be the Declaration of Independence, which outlines exactly why the colonists believed that it was okay to fight against their mother country. And the last thing they're going to do is they're going to establish a military general across all the military. And he's going to be George Washington. Now, George Washington is somewhat famous at this time. He is respected for sure, but he is not necessarily the same man that you and me think of at the time. He had not had very much military experience. The experience that he did have was in the 7 Years' War and the French Indian War. And with that, he didn't always have a lot of successes. He just kind of was a mediocre general. However, he's going to be respected, and so he'll be picked to represent the entire military. And luckily for us, he did, because he became, the first president and one of the greatest American men ever. Now, the war is now officially started. They've declared war, and they need to make sure that people start turning and believing in the war. Wars are expensive. Wars are exhausting. They make people really not like them. So how do you turn people's opinion? How do you make it's obvious the loyalists you're probably not going to win over ever, but how do you get those people that are kind of in between? Well, Thomas Paine is going to write, and Thomas Paine is one of the greatest writers from the Enlightenment. He's going to write a pamphlet that is incredibly famous then and now. It is the second most read founding document in the country after the Declaration of Independence. So it's incredibly well read. And at this time period, he's going to basically argue, does it make sense for us to continue to live under an occupation of a country that doesn't like us and that doesn't do the things it's supposed to for us? Or should we just completely separate and break free from this? Obviously, he's saying it makes more sense. It's common sense to do the latter. So he's going to argue for this rebellion and independence, and he's going to really use the fact that the British are starting to seize American ships as an example of the British doing terrible, horrible things and not being able to be trusted. The most read document in the American canon of documents is going to be the Declaration of Independence. It is an incredibly important document. Thomas Jefferson wrote about 85% of it, and the reason it's so important is that he outlines exactly why we feel justified in fighting the British. We're not just a bunch of rednecks who just decided to get guns and start killing people. We have an idea of why we're fighting, a belief of why we're fighting, and he does a great job articulating that and setting it up. He first starts out with abuses and saying all the horrible things that we've had to live with because of British occupation. Second thing he talks about is self-evident truth, things that are universally accepted. Today especially, the idea that when you're born, you're automatically given life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are self-evident truths. Nobody needs to tell you that you should have them. They're just evident that you should. So that's going to be another point that he lays out really clearly. So let's talk about equality under the law, making it so that everybody's equal and no one gets special treatment. The probably most important one is going to be this one about rights. He's going to outline exactly what Americans believe in rights and what they don't believe. And what we found is that sometimes this suits America, and sometimes it doesn't. Either way, he's going to have this equality and rights. And the last thing, or one of the last couple of things he's going to say is that when the governments don't do these things, when they don't protect your rights, when they're not keeping equality, when they are they're not keeping these things, you have the right to overthrow these governments. Why? Because the whole reason the governments exist is because you gave them consent to exist. We naturally don't live in governments. We're born into this world with nothing basically except family. And so the reason these governments exist is to instill justice, equality, the rights of people. And if they're not going to do it, the idea is then we can overthrow them and make a government that will. Now, I'd love to say that Thomas Jefferson's the one that came up with all these ideas, but he is heavily borrowing from John Locke, who is one of the great Enlightenment thinkers of the era. And Thomas Jefferson will quote him to try to demonstrate why we're doing the things we're doing. Now, the one unfortunate thing is that the Declaration of Independence, while a fantastic document, especially for white men, it does not apply to women, Native Americans, or slaves. So this idea that all men are created, not equal, that's from Abraham Lincoln, but that all men, that there are self-evident truths, that all men have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it just doesn't fit into this narrative because, it doesn't count if you're a poor white person. It doesn't count if you're Native American. It doesn't count if you're black. It doesn't count if you're a woman. Only counts if you're a rich white person. A rich man, I should say. A rich white man. What about women? What about the rich or the poor whites? What about the women? These are going to be some major issues, and women are not going to be quiet about this completely. Most women will be, but there'll be a couple really important women like Abigail Adams, who writes quite a bit under different pseudonyms for newspapers about why women should be treated seriously and why they are important and just as good as men. She'll be one of the first feminists of the time period, and she definitely was a remarkable woman for sure. So let's talk about the contenders here for a second. The main contenders are the British and the Americans, and both have their strengths and weaknesses. Now, the British have the strength of being an incredibly wealthy country. They are the wealthiest country on earth at this time. Second thing they have is they're incredibly confident. They have a trained army, a professional army that knows exactly what they're doing, and so they can do things that other countries would take a long time to be able to do. They also have a lot of firepower. Lots of weapons, lots of clothing being made, lots of everything. And the last thing that they have that's a benefit is their navy. Their navy is incredibly strong because they are the most powerful navy on Earth. The negative that they have is how far America is. The distance between America and England is a pretty big distance. And so that's going to be a major flaw for the British. Now, for the colonists, on the other hand, you have number one, a positive is the home turf advantage. The colonists live here. They don't have to go and fight in England. They just can stay here. Also, it's a defensive war. That's kind of what I just said, is that they don't have to go fight anywhere. They just have to wait for people to come. They also have the French and eventually the Spanish to back them up. And then they have a very dispersed population. We're not centered in just one city. There's lots and lots of people that live very spread out, making it very hard to conquer because you have to go to every single group and make sure that they obey and honor the laws that you've set out. And then just the size and region, even the 13 colonies, is just ginormous in comparison to a lot of European countries. But one of the struggles that we have is that we have these local non-combatants. We have local people living in our area who are not pro-patriot. They're not Whigs. They are not excited to be doing this, and they're upset about it, and they're going to be called loyalists. So let's talk a little bit about the soldiers from the time period. Even though these pictures are backwards, sorry. In the Continental Army, Washington's going to train them the very best he can, but a lot of the men are going to suffer from not being trained and organized very well. So they're going to eventually separate and organize the army into the classes in which they're born into: lower class, peasants, landless, workers, and they're going to judge people based on those classes and where they can be at in the military based on that as well. What ends up happening is there's a bunch of colonists who are underpaid and fed, and they're going to start talking about mutiny. They're going to start talking about how frustrated they are with the United States of America. Now, on the other hand, the British are coming and they have some major setbacks themselves. They have this issue of hunger. There's never enough food to feed them. They have the issue of disease. So many of them are dying just randomly because of diseases. They have infections and amputations because of that. And this all causes a lot of stress and anger for the British. They are incredibly disciplined. They know exactly what they're doing and how they're doing it. And it's made up of lots of different groups, but mostly made up of the lower caste. They are going to hire some German mercenaries we call Hessians. Hessians will be very good at fighting. However, because this is not their battle, they're only in it if they get paid money. So they're not in it for heart or for any other reason besides that. So a lot of people call this the poor man's fight and a rich man's war. The reason they do that is how split the country was in this. So first and foremost, the Committee of Correspondence ordered people to register for the Continental Convention. Or a Continental Army, I'm sorry. If you refuse to do this, if you didn't sign up for this, this would result in prison. This is really essentially the first draft, which all men that are 18 years of age must do at City Hall, right? Now, if you were wealthy enough, you didn't have to actually go serve. You could buy your way out if you wanted. Now, the country's made up of 30% that are against the revolution, 30% who are for the revolution, and then everybody else is kind of split right down the middle. So let's talk a little bit about the wars and what happens. So the first part we're going to focus on is the early parts of the wars. They're going to mostly focus in the north. Again, the south is really hard to take over because they are very dispersed. And so it's hard to imagine what you would write to represent. It's hard to imagine what the British would do and how they were able to fight in the north versus the south. It's hard to imagine them going into the south and being able to take over the very dispersed population at the time. The British are going to be very reluctant to this, and because of that, Washington, who is a little bit more aggressive, is going to have some very early victories. Now, the Howe brothers, who are leading the Army and the Navy, are going to have some major successes as well. in especially Trenton, which is in New Jersey, modern day Princeton. They're going to have some major swift attacks and elements of surprise, which are going to allow them to be incredibly successful. Now, there's also the Battle of Saratoga, one of the most important battles. The British are going to retaliate from our early successes, and they're going to have a bunch of uncoordinated attacks. Basically, they're just going to fire on any colonist and any group of people that they seem to be an aggressor in the battle. So the Battle of Saratoga happens in October 1777. They defeat General Burgoyne, and this is going to boost a lot of morale and a lot of feelings for the Americans, because they feel like they are actually making a difference, that they can actually beat the British, the most powerful army in the world. The French are going to start to assist us in 1778, towards the end. This gives them a lot of people give the French a lot of crap about this, but the French were absolutely essential in our Revolutionary War. They helped us out significantly. The biggest thing they're doing is they're curbing the British attacks. The British are so powerful. We need somebody else that's powerful that can really kind of mess things up for the British. Another thing is that there's going to be a considerable amount of trade between these two groups as well, and that's why we know of so many of these time periods, because there's a lot of integration and interdiscussion going on. The Spanish are going to help us a year later after they watch the French, and their main contribution is going to be their navy. They're going to try to help stop the British from doing the different things they did. Now, there's this multinational alliance, which is a very big deal, because you need to have other countries adopt and accept you if you want to be taken seriously. And so now that France and Spain are accepting us as our own country, that's a really big deal for them. One thing I really like is Alexander Hamilton kind of shows and demonstrates how frustrating it must have been to be a soldier and definitely a leader at this time in America. Alexander Hamilton, our Secretary of Treasury, he was the finance man, was serving right underneath George Washington. And he's going to say, our countrymen have all the folly of the ass and all the passiveness of the sheep. They are not determined not to be free. If we are saved, France and Spain must save us. So what he's really kind of describing here is he's really saying the patriots aren't doing a good enough job. They're not coming together. They're not fighting together. They're being very passive. They make a lot of mistakes. And he's really going to say the French and the Spanish are going to be one of the most significant groups to help us win this actual battle. So we're going to see a lot of support from them. However, in the South, we're going to have a major problem. The South is going to have a lot of what we call Tory support. Now, a Tory is somebody that is a loyalist. So loyalist and Tory are synonyms. The British are going to have some big victories down there, partly because they have so many supporters. And they're going to replace Howe with Henry Clinton. Henry Clinton is going to be a major leader at the time period. And they're going to march down to South Carolina in Charleston. And they're going to defeat the Americans down there. And it's going to be the largest American defeat in the entire Revolutionary War. This is going to allow them to control the South. The British are going to really transfer their power from the North down to the South more. They'll have a lot of parties down there, a lot of time down there to really be celebrating. So then we get towards the very end of the war, the last 2-3 years of the war, and General Clinton is going to be in the South, and he's going to concentrate his British troops there. Now, General Nathaniel Greene is going to go and attack General Cornwallis. Now, Cornwallis is probably the most famous general at the time period. And he's going to attack him in a place called Cowpens, South Carolina. In this, he's going to pretend to surrender, and then he's going to start attacking again. The British are going to not be able to hold on to these rural areas simply because they don't have enough population, or they're not concentrated enough to actually keep a hold of them, if that makes sense. Because the civilization, the population is so dispersed, it makes it very hard to control. It makes it very hard for them to have supply lines. So it sucks trying to shoot people if, bullets are 4 miles back on the supply line. You need them right when you need them. And so this is the benefit of the defensive war that America is fighting, is they don't have to do these things. They can just simply fight where they're at. Perhaps the most important battle of all of them is the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. The reason this is an important battle is because it really marks the end of the Revolutionary War. Cornwallis is going to be targeted in Virginia. He is supposed to, part of Cornwallis's fault is he's supposed to be going down to meet up with Clinton, General Clinton, and instead he gets trapped and gets stuck in Virginia when he's supposed to have left already and gone to another area. The reason this is significant is Cornwallis kind of gets into a corner where all the revolutionists are able to come around him and surround him, and the ocean's right behind him, so he has nowhere he can go. And so they're going to win at the Battle of Yorktown. Again, one of the most significant battles of all time. Now, in the surrender, it's really interesting. General Cornwallis does not even show up. He allows his first in command to surrender the sword to none other than Alexander Hamilton. George Washington normally would have taken the sword, but he allowed Alexander Hamilton to do so because of the great bravery and fighting that Hamilton had done throughout the Revolutionary War, not to mention writing most of Jefferson's speeches. So in October 1781, the Battle of Yorktown is going to be signed, and this is going to cause people to really be happy that the war is over. However, King George III disagrees. He wants to own the 13 colonies, but Parliament basically has told him it's time to be over with this. You cannot fight the colonists and keep control over them. It's just not possible. So at the Treaty of Paris, or the Peace of Paris in 1783, the United States is going to send over some of its best diplomats. They're going to send over Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. The first thing that they go and say is if we're going to accept this treaty between the British and the Americans, first off, the British must recognize American independence. If they won't, then so be it. We're going to keep fighting. Another thing is we need to establish boundaries. Who owns what where, both in the north, south, east, and west. Who owns what? Second thing is they're going to give and demand that Spain get Florida, because Spain had done so much to help us up to this point. So they're going to give Florida to Spain. Also, they're going to say any loyalists who are pro-British and against the Patriots are going to lose and forfeit any land and property that they owned. So if you were pro-revolutionary or pro-British in the revolutionary side of things, you're going to be asked to forfeit that land and property and go to England. They're also going to establish fishing rights, where people can fish and how much. And they're going to talk about the Indian nations. Now, at this time period, the Native Americans, this is a very important thing to realize about the Native Americans with the Americans here, is you can notice that they say basically, England, stay out of our ways when it comes to Native Americans. Don't fight against them. Don't do anything. And their idea of this is that they want to, in the future, take Native American lands, and they don't really want a lot of help from other countries to help support the Native Americans. So the question is how did this all happen? How did America, small, somewhat insignificant colony of the English, go on to defeat the largest empire in the world? The first thing is really British arrogance. The British thought they were far superior than what they were. The Americans had fantastic leadership, from people like Sam Adams to John Hancock to George Washington to any of our great leaders that we had. We had great leadership. We couldn't have done it without the French and the Spanish. We also benefited greatly by the distance between us and the British. But we're also very familiar with our area. Some of our negatives are these non-combatants, and that's going to make it so that, the British, they're non-combatants, they're not helping or hurting the Americans. And again, it's a defensive war, and the population is incredibly dispersed. It's very rural. So there's going to start to be, after the war is over, the Peace of Paris is going to be signed. Several soldiers are going to be very mad because they're going to feel like they're not being paid, they're not being taken care of, and we're going to see them storm the Capitol, storm the congressional members, demanding that they get paid. In December 1781, 400 Pennsylvania militia are going to march to Congress in Pennsylvania, and they're going to be upset and protest for lack of pay, hunger, and the way they've been treated. Just a year later, 200 people in New Jersey protested and sent 600 people against Washington, at which point he'll hang two of them to demonstrate that he's not messing around and he is not going to allow people to be treasonous. And there will be several different rebellions within the North as well as into the South. Now, we don't have a lot of time to talk about, the different perspectives of this time period, but one that we really should look at is women. Women were incredibly important to the Revolutionary War. They worked in camps generally, cooking food, sewing buttons or supplies, doing things like that, trying to take care of the men as much as possible. But they also were really important because they were like spies. A great example is Molly Pitcher. Their whole job was to go to the different country and to spy on the leaders, hopefully allowing them to really get a good understanding of what the British were planning on doing. So these spies and messengers are there. Molly Pitcher is one of them, and they are learning new information all the time for the Americans. Now, this promise of freedom is kind of what the women and the African Americans hope to one day to be able to have. They hope that America will rise up. In fact, if you read Martin Luther King, some of his speeches, I think it's in his letter to Birmingham, he even says, I hope that one day America will live up to its Declaration of Independence. So a lot of people see the hypocrisy in our documents. On the one hand, these documents are great. They're amazing. They talk about freedom, liberation for men. In the negative side of things, they don't necessarily say what race of men, and they definitely don't talk about gender. Most of the time, these women were working in those lines again, and there really wasn't very many armed or able to do much. The South specifically did not want African Americans to be armed. They feared rebellion, so they purposely did not arm them. What you'll see the African Americans really doing in the Revolutionary War is not so much fighting, but like taking care of supplies, cooking, or taking, moving things, cots, temple or tents, all sorts of things, and moving them around. What about the Native Americans? Now, there are 200,000 Native American tribes east of the Mississippi River. There are ridiculous amounts of Native Americans. What do we do with them? Well, you can see from the treaty that basically we knew that we would be trying to take land from them eventually, and that we really don't want anybody to get in the way. We were very happy with those tribes that were neutral, that didn't help the British. But of those that did help the British the most, 5 tribes were really gathered together. These 5 tribes are going to be pro-British, and they're going to help the British fight against the Americans. Now, because of that, the Americans are going to really target these groups. People like the Iroquois, led by Joseph Brant Mohawk, and they're going to really target them and try to attack them. So let's talk a little bit about the legacy of this for the Native Americans. First off, the Native Americans didn't really feel that this was their war, so why would they become a part of it? It's not theirs. They don't really like the British or the Americans. Either way, they don't like them. Now, they also are going to look at the war is not really going to help them. It's going to, in fact, probably hurt them. The freedom and the liberty and the land that you take had to come from somewhere. Significantly, it probably came from the Native Americans. Soldiers oftentimes will be expecting to be paid, and at times there won't be money to pay them. So instead, what you'll see is the U.S. government will pay them with land. Now, the problem is that the land that they're paying them with is actually not American land; it is Native American land, and that's not a great. It's not a great thing. Basically, in the Paris Peace Agreement, the Native Americans going to be wiped from basically understanding their influence to the American Revolution. So some general conclusions that we can make up: 70% of those signing the Declaration of Independence, first and foremost, were trained working in the British government. Okay, those are some important lessons we can have. Second off, class dimensions during the war were significant and were there. You had a wealthy, you had some poor soldiers, you had all sorts of different groups. Third, this war actually strengthened the idea of slavery in the South. It did not help it. And the last one here is that this is a fight of an ideology, that people have freedom and that they should be able to do things that they want to do. That's what this whole thing's about. And so people are going to feel like they have the possibility to express that same thing to their governments. They can have the same kind of wishes. And that's going to be the end of all of our notes there. Now, make sure that all of your vocabs fill out, as well as your objectives. What events happened that demonstrated the colonist anger? We had the Boston Massacre, we had the Committee of Correspondence, and we had the Boston Tea Party. What happened in the Continental Conventions? The first one, they say they don't want war, they want to be unified to the crown, but they want to boycott and have unity. In the third one, they're going to declare war. They're going to not only declare war, but they're going to they're going to declare war. I'm sorry. They're going to declare war, and as they declare war, they're going to make the Declaration of Independence and some other documents that are going to be really important in justifying the war. The significant battles were all spoken of. It started with Lexington and Concord and went all the way down to Yorktown. And our last one, what were the many interests of the different groups? You should name a couple different. You should look at the women, African Americans, and the Native Americans, and really draw some conclusions about that there. Hopefully that was helpful, and hopefully you guys got everything there. Thanks so much.